I'm really sorry to miss you guys today. I feel like I've been gone a lot. It's not my choice. They're sending me again. So welcome to John F. Kennedy's birthday. What? He was born on May 29th of 1917. Let me make sure I got that right. He was our 35th president, as you know. And he died in Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd of 1963. And we'll be talking about his assassination in the next 2 days, but today we're going to finish up the Cuban Missile Crisis and talk about how that helped define his presidency, if you buy that it did. Okay, so this is supposed to be the Bay of Pigs. Sorry that the pigs are piggy banks, but there they are. And we already talked a little bit about Secretary of Defense or Secretary of States underneath these three presidents and how we switched to flexible response and how that cost significantly more money, but also allowed the Cold War to have all sorts of different aspects to it. And so we're going to pick up right here, where you can take a look and see that in 1986, we had our peak of nuclear stockpiled weapons with 64,099, and then saw a fairly dramatic decrease over the last 2 decades, and estimated at about 9,920 today. And Cuba. Okay. From the beginning, Kennedy focused on the Cold War, and he thought the Eisenhower administration had not done enough about the Soviet threat. The Soviets, he concluded, were gaining loyalties in the economically less developed third world countries of Asia, Africa, and in particular, in our case, Latin America. He blasted the Republicans in Congress for allowing communism to develop in Cuba, right on America's doorstep. And so this helped him push him toward defining the military strategy of flexible response. So Kennedy believed his most urgent task was to redefine the nation's nuclear strategy. The Eisenhower administration had relied on a policy of massive retaliation, like we talked about just a little bit ago, to deter Soviet aggression and imperialism. However, threatening to use nuclear arms over a minor conflict was not a risk Kennedy wanted to take. Instead, his team developed a policy of flexible response. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, which will become Robert McNamara, explained the policy. The Kennedy administration worried that the reliance on nuclear weapons gave us no way to respond to large non-nuclear attacks without committing suicide. So we decided to broaden the range of options by strengthening and modernizing the military's ability to fight a non-nuclear war. So Kennedy increased defense spending in order to boost conventional military forces, such as troops, ships, and artillery, and to create an elite branch of the Army called the Special Forces or Green Berets. He also tripled the overall nuclear capabilities of the United States. These changes enabled the United States to fight limited wars around the world, which is what we're going to do when there's a crisis in Cuba. So, here's Fidel Castro. We talked about him a little bit yesterday, top right corner, and he had overthrown a long-standing dictator in Cuba by the name of Fulgencio Batista. Castro gained power with the promise of democracy. From 1956 to 1959, he led a guerrilla movement to topple Fulgencio Batista, and he would win control in 1959 and later tell reporters, "Revolutionaries are not born, they are made by poverty, inequality, and dictatorship." He then promised to eliminate these conditions in Cuba. The United States was pretty suspicious of Castro's intentions, but nevertheless they recognized his new government. However, when Castro seized 3 American and British oil refineries, relations between the United States and Cuba worsened. Castro also broke up commercial farms into communes that would be worked by formerly landless peasants. American sugar companies, which controlled about 75% of the cropland in Cuba, appealed to the United States government for help, and in response, Congress erected trade barriers against Cuban sugar. Castro relied increasingly on Soviet aid and on the political repression of those who did not agree with him. While some Cubans were taken by his charisma and his willingness to stand up to the United States, others saw Castro as a tyrant who had replaced one dictatorship with another. About 10% of Cuba's population now went into exile, mostly coming to the United States. Within the large exile community of Miami, Florida, a counter-revolutionary movement took shape. So last summer, I went to Miami and went to Little Havana, which is right in downtown Miami, to the Cuban community there, a very strong Cuban community, and all sorts of references to Castro and to people like Jose Marti are there. It was pretty cool. In March of 1960, President Eisenhower gave the CIA permission to secretly train Cuban exiles for an invasion in Cuba. The CIA and the exiles hoped it would trigger a mass uprising that would overthrow Castro. Kennedy had learned of the plan only 9 days after his election, and although he had doubts, he trusted the CIA and went ahead and approved it. On the night of April 17th of 1961, 1,300 to 1,500 Cuban exiles, supported by the United States military, landed on the island's southern coast at Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of the Pigs. Nothing went as planned. An airstrike had failed to knock out the Cuban Air Force, and although the CIA reported that it had succeeded, it hadn't. A small advance group sent to distract Castro's forces never reached the shore, and when the main unit landed, it lacked American support. It faced 25,000 Cuban troops, backed up by Soviet tanks and jets. Some of the invading exiles were killed, others imprisoned. It was a literal embarrassment. The Cuban media sensationalized the defeat of the North American mercenaries. One United States commentator observed that Americans looked like fools to our friends, rascals to our enemies, and incompetent to the rest of the world. The disaster left Kennedy really embarrassed. Publicly, he accepted blame for the fiasco because he felt like that's what he needed to do as the leader of the free world. But privately, he asked, how could the crowd at the CIA and the Pentagon be this wrong? Kennedy then secretly negotiated with Castro for the release of the surviving commandos and paid a ransom of $53 million in food and medical supplies to get them back. In a speech in Miami, he promised the exiles that he would return to free Havana. Although Kennedy warned that he would resist further communist expansion in the Western Hemisphere, Castro defiantly welcomed further Soviet aid. So you should know, because I just read it, that the answer is Fidel Castro. And it's something to think about, where there's poverty, inequality, and dictatorship around the world. Here's some of the Cuban exiles that were being trained by the CIA. Jose San, Ramon Manuel Artime, and Colonel Aneda Leva. Okay, so now that the United States has clearly made an attempt on Fidel Castro's life, what option does he have really but to find the protection of the Soviet Union, because we're 90 miles away and we've obviously blatantly tried to kill him.
I have been chosen. Farewell, my friend. I go on to a better place.
And so we pretty much pushed Fidel Castro right into the loving arms. Look at this, Nikita Khrushchev. Oh, you little cutie. Not so cute. Right into Nikita Khrushchev's arms.
She got the name tag. You're in my world now, Grandma.
Mm-hmm. Here, we're going to take a break and see a little Kennedy film.
The idea of a White House run and staffed by younger people, with a 32-year-old chief speechwriter and a press secretary in his 30s, and all these people around Kennedy, there was that feeling that, well, if they're running the political system, surely we can be somehow involved in that.
We wanted to serve. We wanted to do something because young people, me included, in those days, did wonder how we were ever going to top the generation before us, our fathers had fought World War II. They had won. They had beaten the Depression in some way, where we didn't.
On April the 12th, 1961, the Soviets sent cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into orbit around the globe.
The first Sputnik in 57, and then Yuri Gagarin going into space in 61, terrified the American people. People were sitting around and talking about what would we do if the Russians had arms, missiles, whatever, on the moon, and could shoot. We were making the stuff up, but shoot at us at will. Then we'd have to surrender. You know, we have to choose better red than dead. That's what people were thinking then.
In what would become a spiraling series of superpower moves and counter-moves, just 3 weeks after the Soviets manned launch, the U.S. sent astronaut Alan Shepard into space. And President Kennedy promised even greater heights.
We choose to go to the moon.
A man on the moon, walking on the moon? Now, in this decade?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
You gotta be kidding. But Kennedy wasn't kidding.
Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
This bold push into space was also seen as an aggressive manifestation of the Cold War. And so was a Kennedy-supported CIA scheme in April of 1961 to land Cuban exiles in their homeland to ignite an uprising against Fidel Castro. When the mission failed, leaving the exiles stranded at Cuba's Bay of Pigs, America and the president were humiliated. 3 months later, as if sensing American weakness, Khrushchev demanded that all Allied forces be removed from Berlin.
We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin, either gradually or by force.
Kennedy put the United States pretty close to a war footing. A lot of people like me got draft notices. It looked like we were going to war.
For the second time in the century, Americans faced the threat of war over Berlin. But now, both sides had nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. No president ever spoke more frankly to the nation about the real possibility of nuclear war.
In the event of an attack, the lives of those families that are not hit in a nuclear blast and fire can still be saved, if they can be warned to take shelter, and if that shelter is available. We owe that kind of insurance to our families and to our country.
Families were advised to build bomb shelters. Schools held atomic attack drills.
When I was a kid, I was very worried about the bomb. I used to sit under that desk thinking, now, would the radiation fall on top of the desk and miss me? But what happens when I get out from under the desk? Then will the radiation fall? I mean, I didn't quite get it, but it didn't seem to be sensible that I was hiding under this desk. And so I had this worry, and everybody talked about this worry about the bomb.
This nuclear threat over Berlin was diffused, but the Soviet-American confrontation would continue. In October of 1961, the Soviets began building the Berlin Wall. The wall would become a symbol of the Cold War's brutal reality. The newsreels presented Americans with haunting images of people risking their lives to escape communism.
Once a country went communist,
had stayed communist, they had